In Navajo culture, a Skinwalker is a type of harmful witch who has the ability to turn into, possess, or disguise themselves as an animal. Today, I will be sharing 4 stories about real people and their real life experience with Skinwalkers. Ella always went camping with her grandparents at the end of her school years. She always looked forward to it since she loved the outdoors and the woods. She especially loved camping, the idea of having s'mores, taking long hikes, being around the campfire, and the wildlife she would see. Ella grew up in California, mostly near cities, so the forest was her home. She preferred being near trees and dirt rather than buildings and crowded places. Besides, the woods were much quieter and more peaceful. She always felt safe there, like nothing could ever hurt her. But something strange would always happen at the end of May. Ella would have this reoccurring dream during the last week of her school year. She would be in the woods, walking alone down a dirt trail, and the woods were always strangely quiet. She would continue to hike this path until she saw this red fox poke its head from behind a tree. Its eyes were always strangely human-like, but they were yellow and somehow looked like teddy bear eyes, and it would just sit there and stare at her. Now, it wouldn't make a sound, it would literally sit there and watch her. And usually in her dream, she would pet it, causing the fox to finally produce a noise, usually a soft growling noise. Then she would continue walking, and the fox would follow her. Ella first had this dream when she was around 5 years old, lasting until she was about 11. And over the years, this dream would be the same. She would walk in the woods, find this fox, pet it, and then continue her hike with the fox alongside her. But after having this dream for the 4th time, the fox would start to walk behind Ella, and that's when she began to feel uneasy about this fox. She could hear it making odd noises, but every time she went back to look, it was just walking like nothing was wrong, even giving her a smile. Now, Ella was 6 years old and was going on a camping trip with her grandparents for about a week. Now, of course, she was very excited about it, being able to barely keep herself in her school seat for the last day of kindergarten. Her grandparents had picked her up as the bell had rang, and they already had the camping trailer attached to their truck. Ella's grandparents drove an old red truck with only 3 seats, and since Ella was the smallest, she was always in the middle seat. Now, it took about 2 hours to get to the forest and another good hour to find their usual camping spot. It was deep into the woods and far from other people, as Ella's grandparents weren't too fond of being around other people while they were camping. As they set up the camping trailer, Ella wandered around the campsite. She loved to dig in the dirt for bugs, so she sat down on the dirt and started to dig, but she noticed how strangely quiet the woods were. Now, this was strange because it was never silent, not even in the dead of the night. She thought it was odd, but didn't really think too much about it. As she continued to dig for bugs, Ella heard her grandmother call for her, but it sounded like she was very far away and sounded somewhat sick. And then a few seconds later, she heard her grandmother call her name again. Ella looked at where she heard it come from, and it was from the woods. But there was no way that her grandmother was in the woods because she was still unloading stuff from the truck. Now, Ella just didn't feel right at this point, so she walked closer to her grandparents and stayed beside them. Ella soon forgot about her weird encounter as she and her grandparents began to have fun. For the rest of that day, they played card games, sat next to the campfire, ate dinner, and stared into the stars. Everybody started to get sleepy around 9 p.m., so they began to get ready for bed. There were bunk beds that Ella and her grandmother would sleep on, keeping their luggage on the top bunk, and then they would sleep on the bottom bunk. And due to Ella's grandpa's snoring, he would always rest on the trailer couch. Ella would always sleep next to the trailer window just in case she couldn't sleep and wanted to look outside. Ella fell asleep pretty quickly though, being that it was the last day of school and Ella was exhausted. A few hours later, Ella woke up and it was still pitch black outside. And now it wasn't weird for Ella to wake up in the middle of the night since she has always had sleeping issues. Ella rolled onto her side, trying to fall back asleep, until she heard someone calling out her name. Her eyes immediately shot open as she heard her name spoken, but Ella knew it wasn't either of her grandparents. They were both asleep and had never been known to sleep talk before. Ella started to feel this horrible feeling in her gut, like whatever she was hearing wanted to really hurt her. And even though Ella was only 6 at this time, She knew that this wasn't normal. Then Ella started to hear tapping at the trailer window. Soft but loud enough for her to hear. Ella just sat there, frozen in fear. She was trying to brush it off as tree branches or rain, but she knew that that wasn't it. She could tell that it was really someone or something tapping on the window. Then she decided to be brave and look, but this was a big mistake. She pulled the curtain away to only peek, and all she saw were these large yellow eyes. They seemed glassy, yet not entirely accurate. They looked like giant teddy bear eyes, but were cold and unwelcoming. Ella panicked and quickly closed the curtain back up. She hid under the blanket. She didn't know what to do. She could feel tears falling down her face. She had never been so terrified in her whole entire life. She curled up into her grandma's side and clung to her all night. The tapping was only getting louder and more persistent throughout the night. Ella didn't remember falling asleep, but somehow she did. The next morning, her grandpa woke her up around noon, saying that they could still go fishing if she got up quickly enough. Ella didn't want to leave the trailer. She was terrified that whatever she had seen the night before would be in the forest. But eventually, she went outside, but she was just constantly looking around, horrified that whatever she saw last night would get her. Her grandma immediately knew Ella was scared and hugged her when she saw her, asking what was wrong. Ella told her what she saw and heard, and surprisingly, her grandmother believed her. And the next thing Ella knew, her grandmother told her grandfather that they would have to move campsites. It took a bit to convince her grandfather, but still he eventually started packing up and hooked the trailer onto his truck. Ella was put into the truck and told to take a proper sleep, but Ella just couldn't sleep. She kept feeling like she was being watched, thinking that every little noise was that thing that she saw, that if she closed her eyes for even a second, it would get her. But before they got into the truck, Ella heard her name again. At that moment, Ella had never seen her grandma move so fast. Her grandma looked up into the bushes where they heard it, then over to Ella. Her grandma then got in the truck with Ella and pulled her into a tight, protective hug. Ella began to cry again, telling her she wanted to return home. And that's when her grandpa got into the truck as well. And since Ella was sobbing so hard to the point that she was coughing, he agreed they could go home. They started to head out of the campsite, still hurt that something had ruined this trip. And that's when something in Ella's head told her to look back. She slowly did so, feeling an ice-cold fear wash over her as she saw something. A red fox sitting in the middle of the campsite, sitting there with large yellow eyes. Somehow, the same red fox from her dream curled its lips into an eerie smile. After that encounter, Ella and her grandparents never returned to that campsite. They did continue to camp, but in more populated areas. But this isn't the only thing that happened to Ella. Her second encounter was when she was 17, many years later. By this time, Ella knew very well what a skinwalker was, and she was still very paranoid whenever she went near wooded areas. She was still worried about seeing that fox, but never thought about it too much. Ella and her two younger siblings stayed at a relative's house for Christmas. Her relatives were living way up in a mountain area. There was no service to where they lived, so there was no phones. And Ella didn't really mind this house because she still loved the woods no matter what happened. But however, Ella hated how they didn't close the window curtains at night, making it easy for anything outside to see inside. But she felt safe inside the house, and she knew that her relatives wouldn't let anything hurt her or her siblings. Now luckily it didn't snow where they lived, so Ella and her siblings could run outside and play and do whatever. Her relatives also had a beautiful black lab named Pam, which was about a year old. She was very playful and normally wouldn't listen to anyone but Ella's uncle. Although she was easily excitable, she was a good puppy. Now one of the days while Ella was there, her little sister and her aunt went out to the store for a nice girls' day, and although Ella was a girl, she wanted to go hiking with her uncle and her little brother. They left early since the hike was about 4 hours of walking into town. Now it was a chilly morning, but it felt great since they were walking so much. They also decided to take Pam because it was a good way to get her exercise and for the dog to just be free and have fun. Now about maybe an hour into the walk, Ella slowed down a little bit, wanting to enjoy the beautiful forest. And it was so peaceful. Ella could have honestly stayed there forever. But as they continued to walk, Ella started to feel something odd. She suddenly noticed how quiet the forest had become, hearing only their footsteps and her brother talking to their uncle. Pam noticed it too. Her ears went straight up and she started to growl softly. Ella picked up her pace to get next to her brother. You know, there could have been a coyote or maybe a wolf was nearby, though Ella also remembered that they wouldn't be out at this time even if they were there. You know, wolves or coyotes don't walk near the roads. Now, Ella's little brother was only 9 at the time, and being the oldest sibling, Ella's natural instincts to protect him kicked in. Ella's uncle also noticed the silence, telling Ella and her brother to stay close to him and Pam, who was now beside Ella and still growling. Ella began to feel that horrible feeling again, that ice-cold fear she once felt when she was 6 years old. She tried so hard to not think of the creature, but it was all Ella could worry about. She was scared. She felt like she was back to being that scared 6-year-old girl again. However, Ella had to stop for a moment, seeing her shoelace come undone. Ella quickly kneeled to tie it back up, trying to hurry and escape, and that's when she heard someone whispering her name from somewhere in the wooded area. At that moment, Ella's heart dropped into her stomach. Her eyes widened, and she could feel herself shaking from fear. It was right next to her. She heard it clear as day. She slowly turned her head, and there it was, that exact same red fox, still having those horrid yellow eyes and that same demented smile. The first time Ella saw the fox, she didn't see it fully, but this time she saw it much more clearly. Its fur looked matted and disgusting, and it smelled like rotten, decaying flesh mixed with garbage. Its limbs were too long for a normal fox, and the back legs were bending completely wrong. Those eyes were still the worst thing about it, but now they looked emptier than Ella had remembered. She wanted to scream, to run, to cry, but she just couldn't. She was frozen, too scared to even blink. Then she heard it speak again. However, it mimicked her little brother's voice, saying, "Found you." Before anything else could happen, Pam suddenly jumped in front of Ella and started to bark, snapping and growling so aggressively that it scared Ella out of her frozen trance. When Ella looked back, it was gone. She used that moment to run over to her brother and uncle, who didn't see what Ella saw as they were too far ahead. But she heard her uncle start to pray and sing a song under his breath, keeping Ella and her brother close. Ella was too scared to look, so she kept her eyes on the ground and refused to stop walking. Pam had stopped barking at this point, but she was still loudly growling and never left Ella's side as they continued their hike. When they finally reached town, Ella's uncle called their aunt and told her to pick them up, saying that it wasn't safe for them to walk back. And thankfully, Ella's aunt did come and get them, but she was confused since they had talked about that hike for days. On the car ride back, Pam never left Ella alone. She was right with Ella the entire time. Pam knew that something was after Ella, and Pam protected her. Ella was very grateful Pam was with them, because who knows what would have happened if Pam hadn't been there. When they returned to the house, Ella was talked to by their uncle and aunt. Once Ella told them what happened and what she had seen, they started to pray and check all of the locks were shut tight. Then Ella's aunt put something around the doors. It was ashes. Unfortunately, this cut their Christmas vacation short, as Ella's aunt and uncle were worried that Ella was not safe while still in the woods. Ella was taken home the next day. Ella felt horrible that this Christmas was ruined, but once she left the woods, she felt safe again. Ella started to feel better, but it still raised many questions and worries. It was still around. How? Why? What did it want with Ella? Does it want her skin, her soul? Was she just going to be tormented by this thing forever? To this day, Ella still doesn't have answers to these questions, which scares her. Jane lived in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. Jane and her 2 brothers were home alone while their parents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for a few hours, and Jane and her brothers were getting ready for bed. Outdoors, they heard noises as if someone was moving things around outside. Jane's oldest brother went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. Now, this was immensely unusual because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was, it opened the truck door. It began digging through the personal items their family had left in the vehicle. The sight frightened Jane and her brothers, and they knew that they had to do something. They took out a rifle and steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. Jane's oldest brother pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and Jane smelled something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong, it made her gag. Her brother continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. Their parents were returning. The figure looked towards the lights, started to move away, and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. Jane's brother ran towards the truck with the gun. Her father exited the car and her brother pointed to the tree. The thing was poking its head to observe what they were doing. Their father ran into the house and over to the stove, grabbed a handful of ashes, rubbed the ashes over a bullet, and placed the ash-covered bullet into the chamber of the rifle. He walked out onto the porch and fired towards the tree. Whatever that thing was, it didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. Jane's mom chased her inside, and her brothers and father went after it in their truck. There weren't many roads or paths, so Jane's father and brothers chased after the figure. The truck bounced, and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. Jane's brother swears that whenever the headlights hit the figure, he saw a woman, but not only that, she was running on all fours like a bear. Jane's father eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch, it dropped about 20 feet down. He got out of his truck and began to yell in Navajo. He shouted that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days had passed, and there was news that the woman that Jane's father was yelling at had passed away. Jane was always told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name and it will kill them. This story occurs in the northeast region of Arizona near Indian Wells. If you are heading west on State Highway 15 out towards Dilkin, you come to a stretch of road into a small valley. Now, a man was driving home one night and it was very late. It was a drive that he had done before, so he wasn't too bothered by it. When driving on the reservation, sometimes there isn't any way to keep cattle from getting on the road. No fences means that you need to be extra aware. Now, if you see a black horse, you'll be able to notice anything else that may wander into the path of your vehicle. So this man is driving home, not paying too much attention, and he drives down the slope of the road. But when he gets to the bottom of the valley, he sees a horse, but doesn't have enough time to react. The horse came out of the darkness, and the man slammed on his brakes, but could not stop, hitting the horse with his truck. The impact was not enough to deploy the airbags, but the incident tossed the man around in his car. He turned on his emergency lights and exited the vehicle to assess the damage. The front of the car was crumpled, and one of the headlights was destroyed. He cursed out loud. This was the worst place to have an accident, and he didn't have anything to signal for help. He then remembered the horse. The man entered his truck's cab and pulled out a small keychain flashlight. He started shining around looking for the wounded animal. He heard noises, but they didn't sound like a horse. As he approached the sounds, he saw the animal's fur moving from its ragged breathing. As he got closer, he began to realize what it was. There was a naked older woman wrapped in a large pelt. She was moaning from pain. The man stopped dead in his tracks and got weak from fear. He stumbled back to his truck, and although it suffered plenty of damage, he was able to get it started and drove off. Once he got service on his phone, he called the authorities. An ambulance drove out there and recovered the woman. She was driven to a local healthcare facility. Because many of the healthcare staff were Navajo, no one wanted to touch the woman. The woman was known in the community, and she was thought to be bedridden. This was shocking because she was so far from home and her state was immensely off-putting. She still wore her attire when she arrived at the hospital. The nurses called her family to come in, and when her family got there, they removed her pelt and her jewelry. The staff was terrified, but then there was also some non-Navajo staff who still provided her with care. The elderly woman only had bumps and scrapes. Other than that, she seemed just fine. She was able to get up and walk around that same evening. She went home with her family that night, but after a couple of days, she passed away. In the Navajo culture, if you find out who a Skinwalker is, you have the power to destroy them. After the community around Indian Wells found out who, or more fittingly what this woman was, it was for sure that her time was at an end. About 2 years ago, Allie and her boyfriend decided to hike right before the sunset. There was something about the eeriness of the woods at night that Allie liked, but not so much her boyfriend. They had to go through tall plants and bushes to start their hike. They were practically in the middle of nowhere. About a mile into the hike, they came across some abandoned structures and sat down to take a breather. Allie wasn't sure exactly what her boyfriend said to make her do this, but as a joke, Allie whistled and said, "See, nothing whistled back. We're alone." Not even 20 seconds after stating that, they heard a whistle. It was a few ways from them, but still too close for their liking. They immediately started booking it into the opposite direction of the whistle and didn't look back. After running for as long as they could, they realized that they were lost. They wandered around for about 10 minutes before stumbled across some train tracks that led them back into town about a mile down the way. Now, it's important to note that these tracks had thick wood linings on both sides. The right side is where they came from, and at this point they were walking as they had run out of energy and felt safe. They reached the point where they could see the lights from town, maybe a quarter to half a mile away. Down the tracks a little bit, they could very faintly see the outline of what looked to be a deer coming out of the right side of the woods. It stopped in the middle of the tracks and just stood there. Allie attempted to shine her flashlight on it, but it fled as soon as she lifted up her light. Allie could best describe it as that it looked like it had 4 broken legs, and its body was very low to the ground. Yet it had unbelievable speed. It almost looked like a bent and twisted monster out of a horror movie. Allie shined her light into the woods to their left, where it had ran. When she looked into the trees, she saw 2 glowing eyes that glanced at her at least 10 feet in the air. Allie's boyfriend said, "What is that?" in a very concerned tone. Allie told him, "I don't know, don't look at it, just run." They ran and ran until eventually they reached town and walked back home. This happened about 2 years ago, and Allie has tried to come up with a logical explanation of what she saw that night, and still to this day, she can never find a solid logical answer other than it being something paranormal. Allie refused to believe what she had seen for a long time, but she knew what she saw, and she knew she was not crazy, as another person had witnessed the same thing. Her boyfriend never spoke of it again and refused to speak about it when Allie would talk about it. She never went hiking at night after that day. These have been 4 stories of real people and their real experiences with skinwalkers. If you guys did end up enjoying this video, I would highly appreciate if you guys could leave a like on the video and comment below your thoughts on these stories. Also, if you guys are new here or haven't already, please consider subscribing with post notifications so that you guys never miss a story. And with that being said, stay safe and have a great rest of your day.